Hello and welcome back to the Black Dad Brand Podcast. My name is Jamil Pugh. We got Jovanie Harris back again with another amazing presentation. And this time we're going to be talking about adverse childhood experiences, or otherwise known as ACEs. And I think this is an important topic because folks, sometimes don't realize some of the traumatic experiences that we may have had in our childhood, and that impact the decisions and the way we process conflict, the way we interact with people, the way we go about life. So just going through this presentation, I think it's really important to kind of assess. In fact, I think Jovanie will talk about there's an actual test online that you can go and take and see what your ACEs score is. And so I think that's important to think about. And one other thing, there's a book called The Body Keeps Score. And so check that out. It's on Amazon. And it kind of, ties into this whole adverse childhood experiences and how it impacts you today. Well, with that being said, I'm going to turn over to Jovanie and let us, so he can educate us on how adverse childhood experiences impact an individual.
Oh, thank you, Jamil. So today we're going to talk about adverse childhood experiences, also known as ACEs. This is a very important topic because every single person is impacted by adverse childhood experiences. But we're going to talk about, how certain individuals are impacted more and how this really ultimately impacts a person's health. The objectives of today is we're going to understand the ACEs definition and the categories that consist of ACEs. We're going to identify prolonged stress impacts on health. We're going to explore the impact of ACEs on our physical health, and then we're going to talk about why is it important to learn about ACEs when it comes to parenting, which is obviously the most important piece here. So let's talk about ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. Let's talk about the study and how it came to be. So the original ACEs study was done in the mid-90s. It was conducted by Kaiser Permanente and the CDC. They took 17,000 individuals, and what they did is they examined the relationship between childhood adversity, such as like abuse and household dysfunction, and they wanted to find a connection between these and overall health outcomes as a person turns into an adult. The study found that there was a strong link between adverse childhood experiences and various negative health issues, and it ultimately highlighted a need for a more trauma-informed approach and early intervention when it comes to our youth. So what exactly is childhood experience, adverse childhood experiences? Well, adverse childhood experiences are negative or potentially traumatic events that occur during a person's childhood. And when we're talking about their childhood, we're talking about ages 0 to 17. These events often negatively impact a child's mental, physical, or behavioral health. Okay. When we talk about the age really makes a difference. A person experiencing something traumatic at 15, right, is much different than a person experiencing something traumatic at age 4, right? There's a big difference. To be more specific, it's worse when the earlier that it happens to you. A traumatic experience happens to you. Some additional information before we start to unpack ACEs is, our children's brains are mostly developed by the age of 6, right?
Wow.
So, if you think about it, 0 through 6 years old is a very important time in a child's life. And if a child experiences something traumatic during that point in their life, it's not 100% that it's going to result in a negative health outcome, but it does impact a child more. Wow. So ACEs is caused by abuse. When we're talking about adverse childhood experiences, we're talking about physical abuse, emotional abuse, verbal abuse, psychological abuse, sexual abuse, neglect, and even abandonment. When we look at other ACEs, we're looking at other household dysfunctions. we're not just talking about all of the different types of abuse. We're also talking about other things that really impact a child. And some of them you might not think about when you think about trauma. Parent incarceration, losing a parent to incarceration, that impacts a child. One of the parents using drugs or addicted to drugs really impacts a child. Witnessing violence within a home, domestic violence, that impacts a child. Dysfunction caused by mental health issues, whether the mental health issues are affecting that particular child or whether you have someone in the house that is affected by mental health issues. A person being impacted by suicide attempts made by family members. These are traumatic events that can impact a child. Something that's probably a little bit more familiar to individuals, a separation from parents due to a divorce or due to like a CPS case or CPS involvement, or to individuals who have come to this country, just deportation, a family member being deported, right? That's separation, right? That's causing the same kind of level of harm as when a child is no longer able to see a parent again, like such as through like a divorce or a CPS involvement. Also, extreme poverty. If a child is experiencing extreme poverty, that ultimately impacts their health outcomes. And basically any other form of instability in a home. Can you think of any other forms of instability in a home that a child might experience that's not on this list?
Maybe going to different schools, constant moving, inability to have proper transportation, right?
Yeah.
It could be an individual having to, living far, having to take multiple buses, walk, or not being able to be picked up on time, getting home on time.
Well, what about what's going on in some of our inner cities right now, like the risk of gun violence, right? Maybe a person has lost their friend to gun
Yeah.
violence, right? Or maybe even lost one of their parents to gun violence, right? Or maybe it's the constant sounds of guns going off in their communities, right? That causes them stress, right? Or anxiety. So these are all things. If you can think of anything else, please share them. But there's a lot more things that are not on this list, but it's any other form of instability or dysfunction that takes place in someone's home or their environment. So let's move on. So how does ACEs affect the brain? So we talked a little bit about the brain, gave you some background information that a child's brain is mostly developed by the age of 6. ACEs can disrupt brain development in children. It could lead to structural changes. It can alter our stress responses, our emotional and it can enhance emotional and behavioral issues or increase the chances of those happening. It can impair our cognition, and there's an increased risk of mental and physical health problems. So how does ACEs affect health? Well, if we look at the base here, ACEs, can ultimately result in high levels of cortisol. I'm going to talk a little bit more about cortisol and what its role in the body is, and on the next slide. But let's look at this graph right here, and let's look at over time, how does ACEs impact a person? So if you look at the bottom of this pyramid, you'll see adverse childhood experiences. This is when the person experiences, the trauma. Above that, you'll see disrupted neural development. This is when it's impacting the brain. Above that, you'll see social, emotional, and cognitive impairment, right? that's when these changes to the brain are actually impacting, decision making, right? Above that, you see adoption of health risk behaviors. This is now the actions. These are now, actions that a person is making that ultimately make it harder to live a healthier life. And then above that, more of the severe consequences of those decisions and of that trauma ultimately, which is disease, disability, and social problems. And ultimately, ACEs leads to an earlier death. So there's a direct connection between a person experiencing adverse childhood experiences and experiencing an early death. Okay.
It's so interesting how, seeing that chart, I previously thought of adverse childhood experiences, and then you just think about all the outcomes, but I didn't see or know about how these stages kind of lead to the early death. And like you said, the adoption of health risk behaviors, that could be drug abuse, or, not taking care of yourself, or not eating right, or stress is a major conduit to other diseases or discomfort. And so he's the emotional anxiety. I mean, and we're having all this conversation around protecting our mental health and being aware of it, and how that impacts how we operate on a day-to-day basis. So I think this is a phenomenal visual here to really have a visual understanding of how this all works together.
Absolutely. Let's talk about something that really impacts our health, and that's stress. Let's talk about cortisol, right? And its connection to our stress responses. So our brain, um, our brain's instinctual response to protect itself when in danger and when it's under stress is to fight, flight, or freeze. Okay, that's our instinctual response. And cortisol, which is something that's released, when we're experiencing stress, cortisol ultimately triggers these responses. Okay, it's our body's ability to fight, flight, or freeze. Normal cortisol functions work a little bit like a little bit like this. When we experience stress, there's really like ultimately good stress and bad stress. Okay, there's like normal stress, and then there's like not normal stress. Normal stress is things that we all experience. We just got a new job. We're a little nervous about how we're going to do at the new job. Maybe it's our first day, and we're a little nervous. We're a little stressed. You're preparing for that big presentation, right? At your job, or that big, that big day, that's really important. And so you're stressed. Okay. Then you have like not normal stress. Okay. Not normal stress, or sometimes people call it toxic stress. Okay.
Mm.
Toxic stress is, stress that's prolonged ultimately, right? Because cortisol is released in the body, and it helps us to be able to manage this stress, because basically cortisol levels go up when we're experiencing stress, and then they come back down to a baseline when we're not experiencing stress. Okay. But when you're experiencing like toxic stress, like for example, like abuse, a person is being abused in their home. A person is, we talked about gun violence, and we talked about like violence in the community. If a person is constantly hearing sirens, constantly hearing gunshots, turning on the news, constantly hearing about, people in the community, like their lives being taken, right? Then what happens with the cortisol is the cortisol levels never go back down to a base level. They ultimately like come back down to a level and they stop, but they're not back at the base level. They're like still like in the middle. Okay. And when you have toxic stress levels like that, ultimately that leads to worse health outcomes, because our body's stress response system is not responding the way it normally should be, the way it should be for the way it should be normally. I would say. Okay. So think about that. The role of cortisol is not just to impact metabolism; it's also to control our reactions to stress. Okay, and toxic stress is something that's prolonged, and so toxic stress are all of those things that we mentioned earlier. We talked about all the different forms of abuse. We talked about all the different other dysfunctional factors that could happen in a person's community or in their family household. So let's talk about health outcomes. Okay, there's a test that's called the ACEs test. Okay, and it allows for a person to answer a series of questions, and you get scored based on the answers to those questions. If a person revealed that they experienced 4 or more of those adverse childhood experiences on that test, these were the results. A person is has 2 times the rate of liver disease, 11 times the level of intravenous drug use, 3 times the level of lung disease and adult smoking, 14 times more likely to commit suicide or attempt suicide, I should say, 4 times as likely to begin intercourse by age 15, 4.5 times more likely to develop depression. And the one at the bottom is the one that's really something that's all of us as parents should really be paying attention to. 32 times more likely to have learning or behavioral problems. I mean, how many of our children do we see in the school systems that are experiencing learning and behavioral problems? This should really remind us that sometimes as a community and as adults, we look at children who are experiencing behavioral or learning problems and sometimes we say, like, what's wrong with them? What's wrong with those kids? But with this knowledge, we should be switching that and asking ourselves, like, what happened to those kids? Because, there's something that happened to these children that resulted in these learning and these behavioral problems. And speaking from a person not only who's experienced abuse, but also someone who, has, it works with children daily who experience abuse, you'll be surprised how much of a connection there is to what a person is experiencing or the dysfunction that a person is experiencing in their household to the actual behaviors that they manifest, in a school system. And so that should concern us all as parents because, we all have normal things that happen to us that not only have impacted us and we have trauma, right? So, but this is also something that can impact our children. And so when we look at, I'll touch back on that in a second, but let's talk about coping and emotional regulation. Okay. Just because someone has experienced adverse childhood experiences does not mean that they will ultimately die young. That there's not a direct connection there. There are things that you can do to mitigate that. And one of the things is early intervention. So this coping and emotional regulation tips could be something that an adult uses to cope with their own trauma, but also it's something that you could use, with your child if you feel like they have experienced some trauma as well. Listening to calming music. Music is great, right? But remind yourself of what kind of music that you're listening to. You know what I mean? Certain music could have you even more stressed versus certain music could calm you down. Okay. Exercise is really great. A lot of times when we exercise, we're not thinking about the things that are upsetting to us, the things that are impacting us. It gets us in a zone, right? Plus we're able to kind of like, that motion and that aggression that maybe we might feel from that trauma, we can get that out, on the bike. We can get that out, on a punching bag. We can get that out on a bench press. Writing and journaling is really something that people should really consider doing. A lot of times people think of it as having a diary, but that's not necessarily the case. Sometimes it's just journaling just to, put your thoughts that you have in your head down on paper, so that way you can get them out, and if you want to go even further, we can vent or we can talk to somebody. But sometimes people don't have somebody that they can talk to, let alone sometimes you don't have somebody that you can talk to all the time, or when you exactly need to talk to them, when you're really experiencing those, those dark feelings or whatnot. And so sometimes writing or journaling can help you. But if you have a trusted individual, you can vent or talk to somebody, and preferably you should go talk to a professional, because, I know Black folks, we can get to the point where we don't like therapy and we don't want people all up in our business. But, I can say from personal experience, going to therapy has really helped me to address and even understand some things that I've experienced in my life, and to really unpack them, and to help me answer questions that I have. Like, why is it that I respond to things a certain way? Why do I, behave in a certain way when I have particular feelings? These things, can make sense a little bit more when you go talk to somebody. Okay. And it's not all about therapy too. You need other buffers too. You might need a really good friend that you can talk to, that you can confide in. You might even need, somebody who's older that may have been through something before, or you might just need someone who doesn't give you advice at all and somebody who just listens, you know what I mean? And then for folks who are a little bit more, deal with things a little bit more internally, or people who are more spiritual, you could meditate or you could pray. Okay. So this is a really big question. Why is understanding ACEs important when parenting? And, I don't want to give you the lengthy answer, but it's really important. ACEs is important because we all have experienced ACEs. We all have certain experiences in our lives that have shaped who we are. And all of us didn't have perfect lives growing up. A lot of us have experienced certain traumas. But sometimes we don't understand them as trauma. We don't think that we've experienced trauma. We just look at it as normal. And like, for instance, some people, they grew up poor, they grew up in poverty. They grew up with, food scarcity, and but that's how their parents grew up. So they're just, well, it's normal. This is just, how it is growing up in this neighborhood, right? But it's also important to understand that that's actually not normal. And that is a form of trauma. That is something that can impact you. It's important because culturally, and we, this is Black Dad Brand, so we talking about Black folks, right? Yep. Culturally, it's really important to really unpack this subject, because some of us have experienced certain things growing up, and we, like I said before, we think that they're normal just because it was normal in our culture. For instance, sometimes we have individuals in our lives that are caring for our children that have experienced ACEs. And it's important for us to be educated about ACEs, like for example, you might have a parent, who, may help you care for your child, right? But they have a particular style of parenting that's a little different than the new style of parenting that we have, right? It's important to understand ACEs because we want to be able to, intervene when, we notice something like that. I'll spare you the details, but man, I mean, sometimes, Sometimes, old school parents, they deal with things differently. They just want to whoop a kid. They just want to give a kid a spanking. You know what I mean? Um, and some of us remember growing up, and we remember constantly getting whooped, constantly dealing with that level of punishment. It was always a physical punishment that we experienced, right? And as we're in a society where we're trying to move away from that, and as we're receiving more information, and we're trying to, we're trying to, break that cycle, you know, it's important. It was important for me to realize how my upbringing impacted how I approached parenting, right? So ACEs is extremely, extremely important. And then it not only helps us to understand our experiences as parents, but it also helps us to be able to give our children the best experiences that we can possibly give them to ultimately lead to the healthiest outcome for them. And when we examine ACEs, and when we understand that ultimately individuals that experience ACEs have a higher risk of early death, and then all these other problems in terms of disease, chronic illnesses, the learning and behavioral problems that could really shape a person's life. I mean, we all have heard about the prison, the school to pipeline, right?
Yeah.
And this could impact severely, your child. This could, result in your child being labeled a certain way at school.
Yep.
Maybe end up, in special ed. And there's nothing wrong with anyone that's in special ed, but you become on a completely different track. You know what I'm saying? Or be labeled a behavioral problem, right? Which leads to further lack of learning. You know what I mean? And ultimately, losing hope. You know what I'm
Yeah.
saying? And ultimately leading to a less healthy outcome. We know, and we've seen probably people in our own lives, and we've probably seen people that we knew in school, that had certain experiences that were very hard to overcome. And we're finally at a certain age now, right, where we're probably seeing the results of all of these things, right? We see the obesity coming into place now. We see the
Yep.
early death. We're knowing individuals that are dying. We're knowing individuals who are dealing with certain chronic illnesses or whatnot. And so it's really important. Lastly, just to learn about this as we parent, because all of us in the Black Dad brand, we want to be able to raise healthy families. And the only way that we're going to be able to raise healthy families is we have to educate ourselves on all of the potential dangers that our children could experience. And we need to know these things, right? Lastly, just think about just this one common example that we all might experience. If you have a spouse, and you all live together or whatnot, we know that relationships aren't perfect. We know that arguments happen sometimes. We know that disagreements happen sometimes, right? But what happens when your child is witnessing these all the time, right? And, so that's a level of dysfunction that a lot of folks may think is just normal, and it just happens in households. But these are all things that your child is witnessing, okay? And if your child is witnessing them at an early age and continuously taking that in, that falls into the toxic stress category. And remember, prolonged stress is, um, you know, is worse for a person's health outcomes. So, ACEs education helps parents have an informed parenting approach, helps us to break the cycle, helps us to have better communication skills when it comes to our children, and just in general, just people that we're communicating with. Um, I think when I hear that, I think about myself, right? Because sometimes we have certain experiences in our lives, and certain things trigger us, right?
Yeah.
But you ever wonder, like, why does this trigger me so much? It's worth unpacking a person's childhood. That might be, where that may come from, right? It helps us to have emotional regulation. And Lord knows we're going to need emotional regulation, not only in life, but when it comes to raising children. It builds resilience. It helps us to address behavioral challenges when it comes to our children. Okay. It helps to prioritize mental health. It promotes open dialogue. When it comes to our, your child, how did that feel? When you saw mom and dad disagreeing, you know what I mean? Like it helps you to be kind of really promote that open dialogue between, your child and yourself. It also teaches coping mechanisms, some of which that we covered. It reduces parental stress. It fosters empathy, and it ultimately leads to supporting trauma recovery. Because, like I said, we're all going to experience some level of trauma one way or another. But how do we recover from that? How do we address it? To end, I just want to encourage everybody to take this ACEs test. It really doesn't take long. I forgot how many questions it is, but I think it's maybe only like 10 questions or something. Yeah. It's a very short test. It just asks you certain experiences and asks, have you experienced, these things? I believe it's like yes or no. And it helps you to be able to learn like your risk on ACEs. Remember, if a person experiences 4 or more ACEs, right, that ultimately leads to lesser health outcomes. Remember, that doesn't mean that everybody that's experienced 4 or more is going to be susceptible to early death. This just means that if you take this test and you find out that you've experienced 4 or more, you might want to think about how you are addressing your own trauma. And remember, addressing your own trauma is going to help you to be able to protect your child from trauma and ultimately raise a healthy family.
Well, this was quite a bit of information, and I think as people reflect on what ACEs is, what they may have done in the past, or what they may have experienced in the past, and how they might have influenced their parenting. It takes time to say, how can we provide a different experience for our kids. There was this video of Des Bryant, who's a wide receiver, or former wide receiver for the Dallas Cowboys, and he was just talking about like his own upbringing, and he asked the question, how can you expect your children to have a good day if you yell at them before they get out of the house? Or how do you expect them to, sleep well if you're yelling at them at night? Like, thinking like, how are my children experiencing me as a parent? How might they be reflecting on their childhood? And one of the things that my wife and I love to say is that every day we get to write the script of how our children will say their childhood was. In their childhood, like, these are the things that I did, and this was what was normal for me. And we get to, build that for them. And we want to, take that responsibility very seriously. And, change some things that that we were resilient enough to move past. But it's time to uh, our community can't continue to operate from ground zero every single generation. There's got to
Yes.
be a point in time where we can be, we can leverage the previous generation and kind of build off of that and build off of that. And so as a whole, and I love that we're in a space in society where we're talking about mental health, we're talking about ACEs, we're talking about all the things that impact our wellness as an individual, as a family, and as a community. And so this is a very important presentation, and I thank you for putting in the work to really drill down on some of these topics and expand on them in a way that is accessible for our community. So folks, check out our website, follow us on social media, continue to stay tuned to the Black Dad brand. We're constantly going to bring you content, entertaining content, informational content, educational content that's going to help your family thrive. So thanks again for watching, and we'll see you soon. Oh, no.